Welcome back to another video tutorial lecture on American history. And this time around, we're going to talk about the colonies and the new empires within the Americas during the period of about the 1600s to the 1700s and how that really changed the way that things were operating. One thing I want you to think about as we're going through this particular video presentation is I want you to think about the different type of empires and how they established themselves and what allowed for either long-term success or failure amongst these empires. Because what's very ironic about what happened in this particular case is that the empire that you think would have succeeded the most, New Spain, because it covered a ton of area, actually was not as successful as the smallest of the new empires, New England. And why was that the case? So I want us to think here about the consolidation of countries out in Europe in order for the purpose of creating new types of trade routes. And that led up to a type of economy that we're going to be studying about called the mercantile or mercantilist economy, in which new empires sought out raw resources. And in doing that, they became expansive empires, seeking out labor, and the purpose of that labor then using those raw resources so that you could create finished goods. So let's start off then with New Spain. New Spain and really Portugal, but in this particular case, really importantly, New Spain is going to be our first major new empire within the Americas. And it really gets started with Hernan Cortez, who goes in and conquers the Aztecs. Now, most students think the reason why Hernan Cortez succeeded was because he had amazing technology that just overwhelmed the Aztecs. Not true at all. Hernan Cortez did have technology that the Aztecs did not have, but Hernan Cortez only had 300 men. He should not have won this war against the Aztecs. The reason why he wins the war against the Aztecs is that the Aztecs emperor makes a pretty big mistake, Montezuma. He assumed at the time that Hernan Cortez was the gods coming back in order to save the Aztecs from some of the problems that were happening at the time. Montezuma invited Hernan Cortez into his palace, where Hernan Cortez immediately had his bodyguards assassinate all of the Aztec people who were surrounding Montezuma at the time. He kept Montezuma alive, but then he used the next several months to manipulate the internal politics of the Aztec Empire, and then to also reach out and get all the local tribes who had been conquered by the Aztecs to come in and conquer the Aztecs. The next place that we see a very similar type of thing happen was with Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro also goes in and conquers the Incas in almost the same way, going in and basically going into the emperor's palace, being invited in, and then killing the Incan Empire. So the big desire amongst the Spanish was the desire for gold. They did not find this, but what they did find were silver mines, especially within Mexico. And so what the Spanish did was they basically enslaved the local native labor and put them on big systems called the encomienda system. Encomienda systems were used for both farming and for silver mining. And these slaves were pretty much an acceptance within the Spanish Empire. The belief was these were descendants of the Aztecs. These were a group of people who had done human sacrifice. It was the need to proselytize and to turn them into good Catholics. One of these slaveholders was a priest, a monk, named Bartolomeo de las Casas. And de las Casas believed in slavery until he came to the Americas and saw what was happening. He saw the horrible treatment of natives and started to argue that it was important to free them so that they could be treated more humanely. Now, on the opposite side in this debate was a man named Sepulveda, and eventually they had an argument in front of the Catholic priests back in Rome. Bartolomé de las Casas was arguing for the need to free the slaves. Sepulveda was arguing that it was the inherent violent nature of the Aztecs that made them necessary to be enslaved. The commonality between both those this: neither de las Casas nor Sepulveda were arguing for a celebration of the local culture. Both believed they needed to be proselytized. They needed to be brought into the Catholic fold. Why was this the case? Well, obviously there was a religious motive here, but overall for Spain, the biggest motive was the fear of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Muslims had long ago conquered Spain. They had just recently been kicked out of Spain, and the fear was they were going to come back. And so New Spain was based upon the desire for silver. It was also based upon the desire for protection against the possible Muslim invasion. Next up is New France. So New France was over a huge amount of area as well, going from Canada all the way down into the Mexican Delta. And here's why. So Jacques Cartier finds the St. Lawrence River. And when he does that, the next major explorer for France, a man named Samuel de Champlain, sets up a fort in Quebec. What's really important, though, is what they find next. Just south of this area, they find the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River connects the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes all the way down into the Mexican Delta. So why is this so important? Well, if you think about it, it's a whole new trade route. In the Ohio River Valley, we have a massive area for farming and irrigation. There are also a number of American Indian tribes, especially most important is the Iroquois Confederation. Setting up a trade with these Indian tribes meant a huge amount of trade, especially in beaver fur, which became incredibly popular in Europe as a fashion because beaver fur can be used for coats, especially in a very cold climate in Europe. This became a massive new raw resource for trade. So New France basically set up military forts all along the area for trading. Now, one thing that's important to point out about New France, even though it's huge, New France was set up as a military and trading area. So while the land mass is huge, the amount of people who settled was not very dense. Okay, the next major new empire was the New Netherlands. The New Netherlands was set up by the Dutch. What's important to understand is that the Netherlands at the time was basically, it was a country, but it was basically just a big business. How is that the case? The Netherlands had set themselves up as a banking business, and they became central to European finance. When people needed a place to deposit their gold or their silver, they deposited it in Netherlands banks. It was in the Netherlands banks that you started to establish the notion of credit. And while there had been in the past checks, or types of checks, used down in Italy, the Netherlands became the central place to do this. The Netherlands then established the New Netherlands out in the island of Manhattan. Henry Hudson is the one who's going to find it, and then a man named Peter Minuit becomes the director. They established the New Netherlands, or Manhattan, as a business. It doesn't last very long, though. The English are going to eventually overrun it, and this kind of demonstrates, too, why the English were so successful and how they changed things. Because the English seem to have understood a couple things about establishing new empires that the Dutch did not. So let's move over to New England. New England's complicated because there are actually two different groups that are going to settle New England. Up in the Northeast, the Puritans settle in the Northeast, and the Puritans are settling based upon religious ideology. Now, here's a big mistake a lot of students will make. Students often will say, Puritans came here for religious freedom. No, they really didn't. If they had, then the Puritans would have come here to establish the idea that everybody gets to practice their faith in any way they want. That's not what the Puritans believed. The Puritans came because they were trying to establish, religious freedom for themselves in order to establish a religious theocracy that would change the world. Okay, where does this come from? So during the Protestant Reformation, you might remember from last year, Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church. They argued that the Catholic hierarchy had replaced the true source of wisdom and truth, the Bible. And after that, Protestants established various different groups, one of them being the Anglican hierarchy, which was the Church of England. There were a group of Puritans who believed that the Anglican hierarchy was just the Catholic hierarchy all over again, and that it was simply replacing God again and replacing God's Word, the Bible, with a new hierarchy, in this case the Anglican hierarchy. But the Puritans went a little bit further. In the Puritan mindset, they believed in something called predestination. For Puritans, they believed that we were all basically corrupted by original sin. And we were corrupted so badly that none of us could reach out to God. This corruption was so deep and so inherent to our nature that even the choice of God was impossible for us. So only God could choose who would be saved and who would be damned to hell. For Puritans then, some remained in England in the hopes that they could establish a model community. Others believed the only way to establish a model community was to come over to the Americas. Now, Puritans were not trying to separate from England. Puritans were trying to be a model for England. In fact, we get that from their first governor, John Winthrop. John Winthrop makes the argument that the Puritan settlement is going to be what he called a city on a hill, meaning this is going to be the place in which Puritans come. They are the chosen ones. They are what are called the visible saints. And when they come to New England in order to establish their community, they're going to establish a community that will become the model to change England. They established something called a Congregationalist church. Congregationalist church meant that the community that was put into the church would be able to elect the leader, and that those who did the elections would be inspired by the Holy Spirit. So the idea you might get out of this is sort of like the beginnings of democracy here. We're starting to see some very inherent beginnings of the people having power over the political, in this case, religious leaders. Keep in mind, though, at this time period, you had to be a member of the church. The problem, though, for the Puritans is that they're going to grow and expand. Eventually, the Puritan town becomes the Puritan village. There's a town that's right on the coastline that does mercantile trade, and then that expands out into the interior, into the Puritan village. And eventually there was a tension that formed within the Puritan community. So eventually what's going to happen is the Puritan village is going to attack the Puritan town and claim that the Puritan town is just out for economic desires. They have replaced God once again. In this case, they have replaced God with mammon, or the religious term for money. So at that time, there was a revolution that took place back in England called the Glorious Revolution, where a man named Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, took over. They eventually beheaded the king of that time period, and the Puritans took over for a brief period of time, and it looked like the Puritans back in America were just not needed anymore. So between the Salem witch trials and between what happened with the Glorious Revolution, the Puritans kind of die off. In fact, we can get this through something called the Halfway Covenant. This was a compromise in which Puritans started to see their numbers declining. And so they started to tell people, you know something? We can help you to get saved, and that way you can become a member of the church. God will help you, and we will help you. This makes no sense according to Puritan theology. People can't save anybody. Only God can do that. But what it does demonstrate is the decline of Puritans as an official group in America. Their legacy, though, is going to live on pretty long. The other side of the New England colonies were the Chesapeake colonies, and these settled in places like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. Why were they settled? Well, back in England, there was a system established called primogeniture. Primogeniture was basically the idea that only the oldest son could inherit land. Now, think of England as an island with very little land, and the land that's there is not great because you're talking about land in a very cold area. So if you are the second, third, or fourth son of a noble family, the likelihood you're going to get anything when it comes to land is pretty low. So where are you going to go to establish your wealth? You go to the Americas. And you just happen to hear that in the Americas there's this amazing land, amazing gold. And so people went out there, these noble sons, to a place called the Chesapeake, including the Carolinas. When they got there, what did they find? Swampy land and fights with local American Indian tribes. Not a great place to establish your colony. Plus, on top of that, most of the people coming over were noble sons. So these are not people who have been trained on how to deal with the land, how to build on the land. So they were stuck in a pretty bad spot until a man named John Rolfe developed brown gold tobacco. When John Rolfe discovered that tobacco grew really well, he all of a sudden came to the conclusion that this might be a great way to boost profits for this local colony. And that's what they did. In fact, they grew so much tobacco that finally the governor of the colony had to order people to grow other things. People were literally starving because they were not growing corn in order to feed themselves. Now, one problem with tobacco is that it is what is called a labor-intensive crop, meaning you have to have a lot of people in order to get it to be grown. Now, at the time, there was a system to do this. It was called the headright system. You would have poor people paid by local families to come over and to grow these crops. They would work for 7 years for the family, and then after that, they would be given their freedom, and they would be given land. This is called indentured servants. Problem was, after a few times of doing this, land started to become more and more scarce. And in the Virginia colony, the governor at the time, a man named Berkeley, made an agreement with the local American Indians that they were not going to expand anymore, try to tamp down on any kind of conflicts that would happen. Well, there was a landowner named Nathaniel Bacon who saw an opportunity here. He saw that the problem was the more that they ended up not allowing for expansion of land, the less land there would be for indentured servants. So he gathered all the indentured servants together and he had them go out and do a rebellion. Now, in the middle of this rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon died. And so the rebellion kind of just like got squashed and ended. But what's important about this was that people started to realize who own land, if we don't do something about this problem with indentured servants, the more people who come over here, the less likelihood that we in the long run are going to stop these rebellions. So they started looking for an alternative form of labor, and they found one. They found it in African slave labor. So here's the economic turn that we see towards African slave labor within the Chesapeake colonies for this labor-intensive crop of tobacco. The reason why this becomes important is that within the Chesapeake, we start to see a hierarchy forming based on class, land ownership, race, and so forth. Now, at the time, there actually was a local Congress or Parliament that was formed called the House of Burgesses. This is really our first Congress that gets formed within the colonies. Now, you might think, oh, here we go, right? The beginnings of democracy. Not exactly. Who got to be a part of the House of Burgesses? Well, it was the upper class, and it was these upper class nobles. So why did they form the House of Burgesses? It was a great way to tamp down on competition. If you have all of these guys kind of competing against each other, these noble sons, within the House of Burgesses, they would check and balance each other. So this is not democracy in the sense of equality, it's democracy in the sense of checks and balances. Okay, so what takeaways do we get out of all this? Number one, all the European countries were competing with each other because they had to deal with an expansive Islamic empire in the south and the desire for raw resources. Commonality in doing this with raw resources was to create a mercantile economy, and they were seeking out raw resources like gold, silver, tobacco, sugar, and rice. The one colony that tended to be the strongest in all of this was the English colony. And the reason why this was the case was because they settled with long-term family settlements. And that really is going to establish the foundation for them to succeed in the long run. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in class.